She betrayed him, and he trusted another woman who promised revenge. When Duane discovered his wife's affair with the dangerous Jared, his world fell apart. But Sydney, a mysterious stranger, offered him a chance to turn the tables. In her hands was access to Jared's financial schemes, proof that could destroy the criminal's empire. Will Duane risk everything to expose his enemy by trusting Sydney, or will he return to his wife, who claims she's trying to protect him? The choice will be life-changing. Duane was sitting at the table, holding a cup of coffee when he suddenly received a message from an unknown number. Your wife is about to come to the club. I know everything. It was strange since he had never seen this number before. A feeling of anxiety pierced through him, but he couldn't quite pinpoint why. He picked up the phone and tried calling Nancy, but she didn't answer. This moment became a point of no return for him. He knew something was happening, but couldn't understand what exactly. So today, he decided to go to the club himself. No proof, no confirmation, just a suspicion that filled his heart like a dark fog. Nancy had always been like that. She loved being the center of attention. It seemed she gained some special energy from the admiration of men. That's why she worked as a DJ in clubs and often stayed out late. Duane didn't mind her career, but his feelings were constantly on edge because of her relationships with some of the men he saw at the clubs. She often told him it was just part of her job, that it was nothing more than flirting for the sake of flirting. But then why did he increasingly notice that Nancy became withdrawn and avoided conversations when it came to certain people he had seen near her? His suspicions grew stronger, and tonight, he decided to uncover the truth. As soon as he stepped onto the club's grounds, his heart trembled. This place had always felt foreign to him. Here, he felt old, tired, and out of place. The music boomed, lights flickered, and young people danced. Duane had never liked places like this, but he understood that this was where Nancy felt alive. He moved through the crowd, trying not to draw attention to himself. The music was so loud that his heart beat in rhythm with it. He started looking around for Nancy, and then he saw her. She was standing at the bar, laughing with a man who was clearly younger than her, and she kissed him on the cheek. This was what Duane had feared to see. But what happened next exceeded all his expectations. The man began running his hand down her back, and Nancy didn't pull away. On the contrary, she looked up and smiled. Duane could hear her laughter blending with the music, and it became unbearably hard for him to breathe. He thought, "You're betraying me right here, under my nose." He took a few steps back to disappear into the crowd before Nancy noticed him. He could hear his heart beating faster and realized that, despite everything, he couldn't confront her directly. He lacked the strength to either flee or leave her. He just stood there, watching her dance with another man, increasingly convinced that her words, "It's just work," no longer held any meaning. As the night reached its peak, Duane decided to leave the club. He couldn't stay there any longer. Nancy didn't even notice when he left. He felt empty, as if he had been taken out of his own life. And though he had no hard evidence of her betrayal, that night changed his perspective on everything. That evening, he returned home, and Nancy, as usual, came back late. Her face was glowing with happiness, and she was full of energy. She noticed that Duane seemed distant but didn't ask why. He didn't say a word to her about what he had seen. The next morning, as Nancy slept after a long night, Duane sat in the kitchen, replaying everything that had happened at the club in his mind. He couldn't forget what he had seen, and with every moment, he became more aware that this marriage was falling apart because of her games with other men. But he couldn't break the bond immediately. He still loved her, even after what he had seen. His feelings for Nancy were more complex than simple disappointment. He couldn't and didn't want to just walk away and leave everything behind, even if he knew she was betraying him. He needed time to figure it all out. Meanwhile, Nancy woke up and, seeing that Duane was quiet and composed, assumed he just wasn't ready to talk about her nightly adventures. She smiled, knowing he wouldn't leave her. Her tears and smiles were part of her manipulation, and even at this moment, while Duane felt shattered, she still saw him as hers to control. Nevertheless, he already felt the need to do something. He realized that if he wanted to preserve any dignity in this relationship, he had to act now. And perhaps uncovering the truth about her was only the first step toward his own salvation. Duane couldn't shake the thoughts that clung to his mind after leaving the club. He couldn't believe that Nancy, his wife, could treat him this way. He had so many questions and couldn't find answers. How long had this been going on? Was she with him only because of his luck with work and finances? He couldn't understand why it was so important for her to flirt with other men, even if she always reassured him it was just part of her job. When he returned home, Nancy was already there. She appeared unusually calm, her expression as if she knew nothing about what had happened at the club. Duane felt her behavior was unnatural but couldn't muster the strength to confront her with the truth. She approached him and kissed him on the cheek, as she always did after a long night. "You look tired, sweetheart," Nancy said with a slight smile. Her voice sounded like everything was fine, but Duane knew it wasn't. He felt there was something fake in her words and couldn't understand why. He tried to respond, but his voice got stuck in his throat. "Everything's fine. I'm just a little tired," he said, but his voice betrayed more doubt than he intended. Nancy had no idea that he had seen anything. She sat down next to him on the couch and started talking about how hard it was to work that night. Her words sounded almost believable, but Duane couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just part of her well-polished act. Her smile was overly bright, and her behavior seemed too perfect. "You seemed really deep in thought today," Nancy said, trying to change the subject. She noticed the tension in his face, but didn't directly ask what was wrong. Her intuition told her that he knew something, but she couldn't gauge how deeply Duane had been hurt. Perhaps she even assumed it was something temporary and that he'd forget soon enough. "Aren't you going to ask me why I look like this?" Duane asked suddenly, his voice sharp and cold as ice. Nancy was slightly startled, but quickly regained her composure. She carried on as she always did, with the same perfect mask that helped her deflect any questions that might put her in an uncomfortable position. "Oh, everything's fine. Just a tough day," she shrugged. But her answer felt too superficial. Duane felt his heart ache, and he realized he couldn't leave this unaddressed. He couldn't just let it go. But the more he tried to make sense of things, the clearer it became. Nancy was hiding something, and he was ready to find out what it was. That evening, Duane couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, trying to calm himself, but his thoughts kept racing. His mind and heart were filled with doubts and worries. He wanted to change something, to uncover something, but he didn't know how to act. All his suspicions now felt so real that it became hard for him to breathe. "What should I do?" he whispered to himself. Nancy had always been like a star in the sky for him, shining brightly, but now his world felt dark and gloomy. She had been his passion, his hope, but now her presence only deepened his pain. The next day, he decided to act. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of one of her colleagues, but just before pressing call, his heart began to race again. He tried to understand why he was so nervous. After all, it was his life, and he had the right to know the truth. "Hello, John," he said when the call connected. "Hey, Duane. How are you? Everything okay?" John asked, curious. He was one of the people who worked with Nancy at the club. "You know, John, I just want to ask you something," Duane began, trying to sound calm. "Why are you asking me this? Did something happen?" John sounded concerned. "I'm not sure, but I've noticed some strange things. Nancy stayed late at work last night. I just want to know if everything's okay." Duane paused, not wanting to reveal all his suspicions. John went silent for a moment before replying, "Maybe you're onto something, Duane. I wouldn't say anything otherwise, but Nancy's been acting kind of strange lately, and I've heard she enjoys spending time with one of the patrons." These words hit Duane like a blow. He found it hard to breathe. He knew this conversation was crucial, but he hadn't expected such an answer. He coughed, hung up the phone, and realized that what was happening with Nancy was far worse than he had imagined. Duane wasn't prepared for what he had just learned, but now he felt that his next steps were inevitable. Standing outside his house, breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts raced through his mind, offering him no peace. He had just finished the conversation with John, and every word John had said left a deep mark on his soul. "She spends time with him." Those words echoed in his mind like a curse. He could no longer wait to uncover the truth. He had a feeling that the next few minutes could drastically change his life. Images flashed through his head. Nancy, playful, smiling brightly, flirtatious with other guys at the clubs. Somehow, all of that hadn't mattered to him before. Now he saw her in a completely different light. His world felt like it no longer existed. But then something happened that Duane could not have anticipated. When he came home and stepped through the door, he saw Nancy sitting on the couch with her favorite book in her hands. It looked so familiar, so ordinary, that for a moment, he wondered if everything that had happened in the past few days was just a figment of his imagination. She looked up and smiled. "Are you tired?" "I made dinner," she said, trying to act as she always did. But something was off. Duane noticed how her gaze flickered nervously and how her hand fidgeted with the edge of the book, betraying more than her words ever could. "Duane, what's wrong?" she asked, pulling her hand back slightly. Duane shut the door behind him, walked slowly toward her, and stopped by the table. "I know," he said, his voice heavy but calm, despite the pain inside. She froze, and her face changed. Her smile vanished, leaving behind an expression Duane had never seen before. It was fear. "What are you talking about?" Nancy asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. "What do you mean?" She stood up, her hands moving as if to hide something. "I know about you and your friends," Duane said, though his heart trembled as he uttered those words. He felt tears welling up in his eyes, and his fingers involuntarily clenched into a fist. He tried to keep himself composed, but it was difficult. Nancy stepped back, her face flushed. She couldn't look him in the eye. "Duane, it's not what you think," she began, but her words sounded powerless. He took a deep breath, summoning his strength, and voiced the thoughts he could no longer keep inside. "I saw you flirting with those guys at the club. I know you spend time with them, and it really bothers me. This is too much for me. I can't live like this anymore." Nancy sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She stayed silent, her lips trembling. It seemed like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Duane stood nearby, trying to make sense of why this was happening, why Nancy was acting this way. But suddenly, Nancy took a step toward him and said, "Duane, I need to tell you something." Her voice was soft but carried a new sense of determination. "It's not what you think. I couldn't do that to you. You're my husband, and I love you. But I made a mistake. It's not about the guys at the club. I couldn't betray you like that." She stopped and took a deep breath. Duane, surprised by her words, quietly asked, "What do you mean?" Nancy paused and looked him in the eye. "Duane, I didn't cheat on you with any of those guys. It wasn't with any of them. I'm pregnant with your child." Duane couldn't believe his ears. It was a statement that eased his heart but, at the same time, brought a new kind of pain. She hadn't betrayed him, but he was shocked by what he had just heard. You're pregnant? But I thought you didn't want kids." Nancy laughed, but it was a tense, nervous laugh. "I don't know why this happened. I didn't expect it to feel this hard. I thought I wasn't ready for this. But it was my mistake, Duane. I promise we'll get through this together." Duane stood silently, confused by his emotions. All this time, he had accused her of flirting, of something far worse, and yet she was carrying his child. Nancy took a few steps closer to him, her hands reaching out. "Duane, you have to understand that I still love you. You're my husband, and I want to be with you. I know I made a mistake, but please, let's start over." Duane began to realize that all his suspicions had been nothing more than fears. She hadn't betrayed him, but she had been hiding something that could truly change everything. And now, he faced an entirely new reality, where not only pain awaited him but also a chance to change everything together. Duane stood in the doorway, his heart feeling like a stone sinking into a dark abyss. "I need some air," was all he said before leaving Nancy alone in the room. His legs carried him outside on their own, but he couldn't find peace within. What he had learned was unexpected, but something still didn't feel complete. It was as if a piece of the puzzle was still missing. After a few hours, he returned home, hoping to find Nancy still there. But the apartment was empty. Only a note lay on the table. "I've gone to work. We need to talk when I get back." Her words seemed calm, but Duane felt uneasy. Something inside him told him that this conversation would reveal even more than he could imagine. Trying to distract himself, he picked up his phone and began scrolling through messages. Something strange caught his attention. A message from an unknown number that had arrived a few days ago. The text was short but intriguing. "Seems like you don't know what's really happening, do you?" Duane had never responded to it, assuming it was spam or a mistake. But now, he couldn't ignore it. His fingers instinctively typed a reply. "Who is this?" Within seconds, a response came. "Someone who knows the truth. Meet me at the club at 10. You'll get your answers." The club was one of the places Nancy frequently worked. Duane felt nervous, but decided to go. As he entered, the loud music and flashing lights immediately overwhelmed his senses. His eyes scanned the crowd for someone who could have sent the message, but instead, his attention was drawn elsewhere. Nancy was on stage, microphone in hand, looking as though she was enjoying the moment. Her movements were fluid, and her smile was radiant. This was the side of Nancy he had always known and loved, but now it felt like just a mask. "Duane, right?" A quiet voice near his ear startled him. He turned to see a tall man with piercing eyes. The man looked calm, but his gaze suggested something deeper. "My name's Mike. Let's talk somewhere quieter." They found a secluded corner in the back of the club. Mike leaned in closer and said, "What I'm about to show you will change how you see Nancy. But you need the truth, don't you?" Duane nodded, though he felt his heart clench with fear. Mike handed him a phone and played a video. On the screen appeared Nancy. She was in another club, late at night, but not as a DJ. She was sitting at a table with a man, their hands touching, and the laughter and closeness between them were undeniable. They looked as though they didn't care who might see them. "Who is this?" Duane asked, his voice trembling. "That's her client." "Nancy isn't just a DJ, Duane," Mike said, his voice cold but honest. "She works for these guys. Not just for music. They pay her for other things." "I can't believe this," Duane said. "This isn't true. She told me she loves me." "That's she. She's pregnant." Mike shook his head. "She might be pregnant, but are you sure it's your child?" His words hit like a hammer. Duane leaned back in his chair, struggling to process everything he'd heard. But suddenly, he remembered. Nancy had always been fiery, but she had never looked as nervous as she had lately. Was it really because of the pregnancy, or was it just another mask? "Why are you showing me this?" Duane finally asked, his voice quiet but tense. "What do you get out of this?" Mike smiled. "I used to be her friend, but she betrayed me too. She's not just lying to you. She's playing all of us, and I want you to know the truth before you make any decisions." Duane stood up, feeling anger and pain boiling inside him. He looked back toward the stage. Nancy was still there, cheerful and full of life. She looked as if nothing in her world could go wrong. "What are you going to do?" Mike asked. Duane turned to him, his eyes burning with determination. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and then she'll find out what it means to play with me." Duane sat in his car, parked near the club, watching the entrance. His mind raced with thoughts. Why was he still trying to hold onto a marriage that was falling apart before his eyes? His fingers unconsciously tightened around the steering wheel as he stared at Nancy walking out of the club. She looked happy, far too relaxed for someone who had just finished a night of work. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. A man was with Nancy. They talked, laughed, and didn't seem to care that anyone could see them. The man held her elbow, and they both got into a sleek black sports car. That was the last straw. Duane started the engine, but not to follow them. He knew that wherever they went, nothing good would come of it. A few hours later, he found himself in a half-empty bar filled with the smell of smoke and cheap alcohol. Sitting in a dark corner, he scrolled through his phone and finally opened his chat with Nancy. 100 times, he wanted to type out everything he was feeling, but each time, he deleted the message. Instead, he ordered another glass of whiskey. "Tough day, huh?" someone nearby said. The voice belonged to a woman with messy chestnut hair, holding a glass of red wine. She looked like she'd come there to escape something too. Her eyes were sharp, but without judgment. "Mind if I sit?" Duane nodded silently, saying nothing. She sat across from him and smiled slightly. "I'm Lauren." "Duane," he replied shortly, feeling his tension ease just a little. Looks like you're looking for answers at the bottom of a glass, she said, carefully spinning her wineglass in her hand. What happened? Duane hesitated, but something in her tone compelled him to speak. He briefly told her about Nancy, her flirting, and the recent discoveries. Lauren listened attentively, not interrupting as he poured out his thoughts. You know, sometimes we hold on to people who don't deserve it because we're afraid of being alone, she finally said. But sometimes, staying with them hurts even more. Her words sounded like they came from experience. They continued talking, and for the first time in a long while, Duane felt heard. Each sip of alcohol seemed less bitter when she laughed at his jokes or validated his feelings. The night passed quickly. Eventually, they left the bar and wandered through the quiet city streets. Her laughter echoed in the stillness, like a melody he didn't want to forget. When they stopped outside her apartment, Lauren turned and looked at him. You know, you deserve more than what you're settling for right now, she said softly. Her words made his heart clench. He didn't know how it happened, but their lips met. It was unexpected, but it didn't feel like a mistake. Her warmth felt real in a world that had long grown cold for him. The next morning, Duane woke up in her apartment. Sunlight streamed through the partially open curtains, and for a moment, he forgot about everything. Lauren lay beside him, her hair spread across the pillow, looking so peaceful that it seemed almost unreal. But reality hit quickly when he saw several missed calls from Nancy. Her name on the screen brought back the bitterness. He quietly got up, trying not to wake Lauren, and stepped out onto the balcony. The wind chilled his skin, but only one question filled his mind. What next? When he returned home, Nancy was already waiting for him. She sat on the couch, her face serious but unlike her usual demeanor. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. We need to talk, she said. You need to explain yourself, Nancy, he said, his voice sounding as if he already knew all the answers. It's not what you think, she began, but Duane interrupted her. Then tell me what it is. His tone was cold, almost detached. Nancy sighed and started talking. She admitted that she had been involved with the men he had seen, but it was part of her job. It turned out she was engaged in financial schemes, using her charm to profit from wealthy clients at the club. It was for us, Duane. You know we couldn't live on just your salary, she justified herself. His eyes burned with anger. Do you even understand what you've done? This isn't just betrayal, it's something far worse. He felt the ground beneath his feet cracking. I did it for us, she shouted back, but her words rang hollow. Duane suddenly realized that her words no longer meant anything to him. Everything that had once been important now seemed like a lie. He said nothing. He simply grabbed his keys and walked out of the apartment. Now, alone with his thoughts, he realized that Lauren seemed like the light he had found in the darkness. But was he ready to leave everything behind for something new? Duane stared at his phone screen when a message appeared, making his heart sink again. It was from Lauren, but the text was short and unsettling. I think we're in danger. I need to talk to you. Those words caught him off guard. He was already emotionally unstable after Nancy's confession, but now the situation seemed even more complicated. What did this message mean? Why was Lauren, who had seemed so open and warm yesterday, suddenly talking about danger? Duane didn't hesitate for long. He got into his car and drove to her apartment. The drive felt endless, even though it was only a couple of miles. His heart pounded, and his mind raced with thoughts about what else could go wrong. When he finally reached her door, Lauren opened it almost immediately. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked anxious. What's going on? He asked as he stepped into the apartment. Lauren quickly closed the door behind him and lowered the blinds. She motioned for him to sit on the couch, but she remained standing, wringing her hands. I think someone's been watching me, she said, finally meeting his gaze. After our meeting, I noticed a car parked outside my building. I saw it yesterday, and today it's back again. And this isn't just paranoia, Duane. Who could it be? He asked, surprised. You told me you weren't hiding anything. She sighed, dropping her gaze. I told you I tried to leave my past behind, but not everything worked out the way I hoped. There are people I owe, and it seems they've decided to remind me of it. Duane felt anger and frustration rising inside him. More secrets. Once again, He was being drawn into someone else's problems that he didn't create. But looking at Lauren, he couldn't just walk away. There was something about her that moved him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine humanity. "What do you want to do?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "I don't know," she admitted honestly, "but I can't drag you into this. I've already seen people suffer because of me. You deserve better." Her voice sounded firm, yet weak at the same time. She was afraid for him, even though they had only known each other for a few days. And that only strengthened his resolve to help her. "No, Lauren, we'll figure this out together. Tell me everything, and I'll help." She hesitated, but eventually sat down next to him and began to talk. Lauren had once worked in real estate and had ties to people involved in money laundering. She had been just a middleman. But one day she made a mistake by signing documents that now haunted her. Her former partners were demanding money she didn't have, and now, it seemed, they were taking more drastic measures. "They warned me they wouldn't let this go, but I've already given them everything I could. Now they want more." Her voice trembled as she buried her face in her hands. Duane felt a familiar anger stirring inside him again. But this time, it wasn't directed at Lauren, but at the world that had trapped her. He wrapped his arms around her, whispering that everything would be okay, even though he didn't yet know how. The next morning, he returned home to grab some of his belongings. But inside, Nancy was waiting for him. She looked exhausted, and her face was grim. "Where have you been?" she asked, not even trying to hide her resentment. "That's none of your business anymore," he replied coldly as he packed a bag. "I know you've been with someone else," she said, trying to control her voice. "But, Duane, you need to understand that now is not the time for emotional decisions. You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." He spun around sharply to face her. "What do you mean?" Nancy sighed, lowering her head. "I know about Lauren, and I know what she hasn't told you. Duane, she's not who she says she is. Her former partners have already contacted me. They know about you because she told them herself." Those words threw him off balance. "What? No, this has to be some mistake," he said, though a seed of doubt had already been planted inside him. "No, Duane, it's the truth," Nancy insisted. "She's using you to divert attention away from herself. And if you don't stop, you're going to drag yourself into even bigger trouble." His hands clenched into fists. He couldn't believe it. Lauren was the one who had helped him feel something real. But now his mind was filled with thoughts tearing him apart from the inside. "I need to figure this out," he said as he walked out of the apartment. He drove back to Lauren's place, full of doubt and anger. When she opened the door, her eyes were once again filled with worry. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing his expression. "Tell me the truth, Lauren. Everything." And this time, no lies. His voice was cold, but deep down, he hoped she would deny everything Nancy had said. Lauren paused for a few seconds, looking at him, then said softly, "You may not believe me, but everything I've done was to protect both of us." Duane froze as Lauren pulled a folder from a drawer and placed it on the table. He hadn't expected to see his name printed in bold letters on the cover. "What is this?" he asked coldly, staring at the folder with apprehension. Lauren lowered her eyes, her voice quiet but firm. "This is everything they have on you, and it's what I've been trying to keep hidden. They know who you are, Duane. They know about your financial dealings, about what happened to your business after the bankruptcy. They're using this as leverage to force me to do what they want." He opened the folder and quickly skimmed through the pages. There were reports, statements, even photographs of his house and car. It all looked like a meticulously compiled dossier. "Why would they do this?" His voice was filled with anger. "Why drag me into this?" "Because I told them you were important to me," Lauren admitted, her voice trembling. "I wanted to protect you, but I only made things worse." Duane threw the folder onto the table and took a few steps toward the window. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just a week ago, his biggest problems were Nancy's betrayal and trying to figure out what to do next. And now he was entangled in some dangerous game where every move felt like a trap. "What do they want?" he asked, still looking out the window. "They want me to find a client for them who can invest in their new project. A big business venture that will cover up their schemes. I refused, but they decided to force me by using you. So this is all about money." he asked sarcastically. Over and over again. It all comes down to money. Lauren stepped closer but didn't dare touch him. Duane, I know how this sounds, but you have to understand. I didn't want this to happen. I tried to keep you out of it. He turned to her, his gaze cold and heavy. If you really want to help, then tell me everything. Who are these people? What can they do? And most importantly, why did you think I could handle this? Lauren sighed, wringing her hands. Their leader is Jared Cross. He was my client years ago when I was still in real estate. We made a few deals that seemed legal at the time, but later I realized they were just covers for laundering money. When I decided to step away from that business, Jared wouldn't let me go. He said if I ever tried to cut ties, he'd do everything to ruin my life. Duane stood silent, processing her words. It seemed the situation was far more complicated than he'd imagined. But he also felt that Lauren was still holding something back. And you're still not telling me the whole truth, are you? He finally asked, looking her straight in the eye. There's something else, Lauren said, averting her eyes but then meeting his gaze again. Jared knows about your situation with Nancy. He knows that you found out about her schemes, and he's using it as extra leverage. How could he know that? Duane demanded angrily. I haven't told anyone. Nancy reached out to him herself, Lauren admitted. She wanted to protect her own interests and made a deal with him behind your back. That was the last straw. Duane felt a wave of anger wash over him. He could no longer tell who could be trusted and who couldn't. Everyone he thought was close to him had turned out to be part of this web of lies and manipulation. Enough, he said, his voice rising. I'm done being a target in your games. If Jared wants something from me, he can come and tell me himself. Lauren looked stunned, but didn't have time to respond. Suddenly, there was a knock at the apartment door. The sound was sharp and insistent, making them both jump. It's them, Lauren whispered, her face turning pale. Duane didn't hesitate. He quickly approached the door but didn't open it. Instead, he called out loudly, Who is it? Open the door, Duane, a voice replied from the other side. We just want to talk. The voice was calm, but there was an underlying menace to it. Duane realized this had to be Jared. He glanced back at Lauren, who silently nodded. Fine, Duane said, bracing himself for the worst. He opened the door and saw a tall man in an expensive suit flanked by 2 bodyguards. So, we finally meet, Jared said, smiling like a predator. I hope you understand that you're playing by my rules now. Duane stood in the doorway, staring directly into Jared's eyes. For the first time in his life, he realized that fear had a scent, a mix of sweat, skin, and something intangible, almost chemical. Jared stepped forward, leaning in slightly, as if studying Duane's every move. His smile was casual, but his eyes revealed his predatory nature. You strike me as a smart man, Duane, Jared began, glancing briefly at Lauren, who stood frozen behind him. But why would you think you could avoid the consequences? What do you want? Duane asked sharply, his voice icy. I want peace, Jared replied, spreading his arms. Think of it as a partnership. We both win if you play by the rules. Your rules? Duane asked skeptically. Jared nodded. Only mine. But trust me, they're much simpler than you think. All I want is for you to help us with a small project. You want to protect yourself and, he glanced at Lauren, your friend, don't you? I don't even know what you want from me, Duane snapped. And if it's something illegal? Legality is a relative concept, Jared interrupted, licking his lips. Some things exist outside the bounds of paperwork, but not outside reality. Duane tried to gather his thoughts. All the while, he could feel the weight of the bodyguard's stares, like statues watching his every move. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not becoming part of whatever you're doing, Duane finally said, his fists clenched. That's a shame, Jared said, lowering his gaze, his voice hardening. Because now you're a problem, and I don't like problems. Lauren stepped forward, trying to intervene. Jared, this isn't his problem. I'll handle it, just like we agreed. Just give me more time. Time, Jared interrupted, turning to her. You've used up all your time, Lauren, and now it's up to him. At that moment, Duane realized there was no way out. He was cornered, but that didn't mean he was giving up. His mind raced, searching for options. Fine, he said unexpectedly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'll listen to what you're proposing, but only if you leave Lauren out of it. Jared raised an eyebrow, clearly pleased. Smart choice. Fine, we'll meet tomorrow. Don't be late. He nodded to the bodyguards, and they slowly made their way to the exit, leaving Lauren and Duane in tense silence. When the door closed, Duane turned sharply to her. This was wrong, he said, his voice shaking with anger. You knew they were coming, and you did nothing to stop it. You don't understand, she replied almost pleadingly. They're dangerous. If I had tried to do anything, they would have destroyed everything. And you think that hasn't already happened? He pointed at the folder on the table. Look at it, Lauren. This is already the end. He didn't wait for her response. He grabbed his jacket, car keys, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. His thoughts were chaotic, but one idea burned brighter than the rest. He had to do something to break free from this web, and perhaps his new acquaintance could be the glimmer of hope he desperately needed. He drove to the bar where he had met Sydney the night before. Her smile, her understanding, her gaze that seemed so genuine. Duane realized he wanted to see her again. The bar was nearly empty when he entered. Sydney was sitting at the same table as yesterday. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. I didn't think you'd come back, she said as he sat down across from her. I couldn't stay away, he admitted honestly. You feel like the only light in my life right now. She smiled, but her eyes remained serious. You look like you're going through something heavy. And I am, he said, taking a sip of beer. But I don't want to talk about it right now. Tell me about yourself instead. She sighed, as though hesitant, but then began to speak. Her voice was calm, and her stories were captivating. She was an artist who painted for small galleries. Her works were unconventional, filled with hidden meanings. You'll have to show me your work, he said when she finished. If you want, you can come over tomorrow, she offered. I'll show you everything. His heart raced. He felt a part of the weight on his soul lift. But everything changed when Duane returned to his car. In the darkness near the parking lot, a man stood waiting. As Duane approached, he saw the man's face. It was one of Jared's bodyguards. We're watching you, the man said quietly. Don't do anything stupid. The man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Duane in a cold sweat. Duane pulled up to his house and immediately felt that something was off. The kitchen light was on, even though he distinctly remembered turning it off before leaving. A sense of unease crept up his spine. He parked the car and carefully got out, glancing around. The street was empty, but it was too quiet, even for this late hour. Trying not to make a sound, he approached the door. The lock was intact, but when he touched the doorknob, it turned easily. Someone was inside his house. Opening the door, Duane froze for a moment. In the living room, two men were standing, clearly Jared's bodyguards. One of them was lounging on the couch with his feet on the coffee table, while the other wandered around, examining the photos on the walls. From the kitchen, he heard movement, and he immediately guessed who it was, Lauren. Do you always leave your doors unlocked? One of the men asked sarcastically, noticing him. What are you doing here? Duane demanded, trying to hide his fear. Jared wants to make sure you haven't forgotten about our arrangement, the other replied, taking a framed photo off the wall and inspecting it, as if searching for a hidden meaning. I haven't forgotten, Duane replied coldly, but this is my house. You have no right to be here, right? The man laughed, setting the frame back on the wall. Forget about rights. We're playing by our rules now. At that moment, Lauren emerged from the kitchen, her face pale. She looked terrified but was trying to maintain her composure. I told them this wasn't necessary, she said quietly, looking at Duane. They just want assurances. Assurances? Duane stared directly at her. You let them into our home? We didn't have a choice, she replied, her voice weak and uncertain. We always have a choice, he shot back harshly. The bodyguards exchanged glances, and one of them slowly stepped closer. You don't seem to understand, he said, smirking, though his eyes remained cold. We're here to help. Get out, Duane said firmly, or I'll call the police. The man tilted his head, as if weighing his words, then chuckled again. The police? That's cute. But we both know you're not going to do that. Why? Duane felt his patience slipping. Do you think I'm afraid of you? No, the man said, pointing at Lauren. You're afraid for her. At that moment, Duane realized they were right. Despite his anger and frustration, he still felt a sense of responsibility for Lauren. That was his weakness, and they knew it. We'll leave you for tonight, the second guard said, walking toward the door. But tomorrow, you'll have to make a decision. Jared doesn't tolerate refusals. They left, leaving Lauren and Duane in stifling silence. He looked at her, waiting for an explanation, but she only lowered her head. I know you're caught up in this again, he finally said. And this time, I'm not staying silent. Duane, she started, but he raised a hand to cut her off. No buts. You had a chance to tell the truth, but you chose lies again. And now they're using me to control you. She fell silent, and he knew he wouldn't get anything else out of her. Turning away, he went upstairs to the bedroom, leaving her standing there. The next morning, Duane drove to the bar again, hoping to see Sydney. Her presence was the only thing that could bring him some semblance of peace. She was already waiting for him at the same table. You look worse than yesterday, she said as he approached. Maybe because today everything got even more complicated, he replied, sitting down across from her. Want to talk about it? She asked, looking at him with a kind of understanding he hadn't felt in a long time. And he told her everything. About Lauren, Jared, the guards. About how his life had turned into a nightmare. She listened intently, not interrupting, only nodding occasionally. You know what I think, she said when he finished. You need help. And who's going to help me? He asked bitterly. The police? They won't do anything. Not the police, she replied. Me. Her words caught him off guard. You? He raised an eyebrow in disbelief. What can you do? More than you think, she smiled. Just trust me. In that moment, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was ready to trust someone. And maybe this was his only chance to escape this nightmare. Duane stood in the parking lot outside the bar, gripping his phone tightly. Sydney's message was brief. I have an idea, but it's risky. Meet me tomorrow evening. At home, Lauren was waiting for him, silent and tense, as if she understood the thread of trust between them was about to snap. Duane closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. Two worlds collided in a whirlwind. Sydney offered a sense of freedom and calm, but her plans seemed dangerously uncertain. Lauren, she was his past, his present, and possibly his future, but all he could see in their marriage now was lies. He returned home late that night, trying to be as quiet as possible. But Lauren was already waiting. Her eyes were red from crying, but this time, she didn't try to speak first. Her silence seemed to demand an answer from him. We can't keep doing this, Duane began, stopping in the doorway to the living room. I'm tired of fighting for us alone. I know, she replied, her voice strangely calm. But there's something important you need to know. She took a folder off the shelf and placed it on the table in front of him. Duane opened it suspiciously. Inside were documents, bank statements, contracts, and a copy of their prenuptial agreement. His eyes stopped on a clause he hadn't noticed before. In the event of divorce, the initiating party forfeits the right to half of the marital property. You knew about this? He asked sharply. It was Jared's plan, she admitted, lowering her gaze. He said it was a way to protect me. I didn't know it would turn into a trap for you too. Duane was silent, feeling anger build inside him. This was just more proof that he had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. But the main question still hung in the air. Why had Lauren decided to show him this now? Why are you doing this? He asked, trying to keep his emotions in check. Because I realize I've lost you, she said quietly. And even if you decide to leave, I don't want you to lose everything. Her words confused him, but they didn't change the reality. He couldn't trust her anymore. The next evening, he met with Sydney. She was sitting at the same table as always, looking calm, but there was a fire in her eyes. Are you ready? She asked as he sat across from her. Ready for what? He asked, watching as she pulled a small laptop from her bag. Ready to put an end to all of this, she replied, opening the screen. I have access to Jared's system. This is your chance to change the game. Duane felt his heart tighten. This was a dangerous move, but it could be the end of his nightmare. The question was whether he was ready to trust Sydney enough to risk everything. At the same time, the image of Lauren came to his mind, her tired face and the quiet words, "I don't want you to lose everything." "What do you want to do?" he asked, finally making a decision. Sydney smiled but didn't answer. Instead, she turned the laptop toward him, revealing data about Jared's financial schemes. Duane felt power slip into his hands, but was he ready to use it? What do you think? Should Duane take the risk and trust Sydney to expose Jared? Or should he choose another path and try to salvage his relationship with Lauren?